I've had a few requests to talk about the Netflix show Adolescence, so I watched it, and that's exactly what I'll be doing today. I'll be talking about the psychology of what's going on and basically trying to unpack the question, who is responsible for what happened in the show? Who is responsible for teenage boys or prepubescent boys falling down the manosphere pipeline? Spoiler alert, there will be spoilers in this, but let's get into it. So before I get into my thoughts on the show, let me just give you a brief summary of the plot in case you haven't seen it. In episode 1, we see the UK police charging into a house to arrest a 13-year-old boy named Jamie for murder. And when they charge in, we see a very young-looking boy who also passes some urine out of fear, which really paints a shocking picture. How can a prepubescent boy be a murderer? How can a child, who we usually associate more with the image of a victim, be the perpetrator of such a heinous crime? So he's detained by the police, which seems like a very traumatic experience, but also the police do walk him through it, advise him to seek legal counsel, assess for risk, give him breakfast, give him the option of having an adult with him in the room. So I think by nature of being detained or being arrested, that's extremely traumatic in and of itself, but the police in this show do a really good job of trying to mitigate that. Question for my British followers: is that typical of the UK police? Because I can tell you it's definitely not typical of American police, but are they always this careful with liability in the UK? Or is it just with minors, or is it just in the show? I'd be curious about that. Anyway, so the boy's dad and his lawyer accompany him for the police interview, where we learn that there's CCTV footage of Jamie stabbing his female classmate to death. Then in episode 2, we see the police officers investigating it further at school, and there they learn that Katie, the victim of the crime, was actually cyberbullying Jamie on Instagram, calling him an incel. In episode 3, we see a psychologist assessing Jamie. Jamie feels kind of tricked by her indirect questions about the men in his family. He has a few violent outbursts. He starts screaming at the psychologist, throwing things, intimidating her, verbally taunting her. And we learn a little bit more about his attitude towards women. Although I do feel like the show could have gone much deeper into telling us how exactly he was indoctrinated into dehumanizing women. We basically learn that he sees women kind of as objects, doesn't have a lot of empathy for them. Episode 4 focuses more on Jamie's family while he is away. It's the dad's birthday, and we see a very stark contrast between Jamie's toxic internet dynamics with women versus his parents' very real life relationship, which isn't perfect, but certainly seems characterized by a lot of love and affection. And this, I think, is really sad, the irony that the manosphere is contributing to the loneliness epidemic for males, convincing young boys that they are victims of women or society, that they shouldn't value women. Those boys may never truly experience love and connection if they don't deprogram themselves from dehumanizing the opposite sex. During this episode, we also get to see the dad's anger issues in real life. He does have some violent tendencies, not towards his own family. He seems like a nice enough guy, but he seems to really struggle with emotion regulation, particularly when it comes to anger. We also learn a little bit more about the dad's upbringing, the cycle of intergenerational trauma. More on that in a second. And at the end, Jamie calls his dad to wish him happy birthday and to let him know he's changing his plea to guilty. And the show ends with Jamie's dad in Jamie's room, which very much looks like a child's room, yet a child who committed, again, the crime you would expect associated more with an angry, hateful man, a grown man. And so the show is kind of bookended with the same contrast of what it means for boys to be both victims and perpetrators of the patriarchy. So who is responsible for what happened in this show? Who is responsible for Jamie's actions? Before I get into my answers, I would love to hear what your personal opinion is down in the comments below. One possibility is that it's the family's responsibility. We learn in the show that the father is kind of a role model for anger issues and poor emotion regulation. The same-sex parent is always an important role model for children, so any issues that they haven't worked on or trauma that they've inherited from their own parents will very likely have an impact on their own children. We see how Jamie becomes very angry, volatile, and defensive when questions about his dad's arise during the psychological assessment. Particular triggers for him seem to be the psychologist suggesting that he and his dad both have anger issues and that his dad is ashamed of him. So it's really important for young boys to feel like their dads are proud of them, that their dads are not ashamed of them. And Jamie's dad discloses to his wife how his own father used to physically abuse him and how he vowed to never do that to his own kids. And I think here we see how each generation in general strives to be better for their kids than they experienced. But sometimes better is just not enough. And perfection isn't possible, but if you don't unpack your traumas, you're simply not going to make enough progress to spare your own children from inheriting the cycle of intergenerational trauma. I think the show also paints a picture of how uninvolved the parents were, that Jamie had a lot of secrets. He lied to them. He was doing a lot of things online that they weren't aware of, to the point where his dad was so convinced of his innocence during the police interview that he went against the attorney's advice. And then at the end of the show, we hear a little bit more about Jamie's life at home, how he wouldn't come out of his room, how he was up on his computer for hours until late. And the dad tells the mom there was nothing we could do about that. But wasn't there though? It's really hard because parents struggle to keep up with day-to-day life, to put food on the table, to set healthy boundaries around technology with their children, especially if there's an element of like poverty or economic instability. This last one can really fall to the wayside and not be a priority, because if your child is keeping themselves occupied, not throwing a temper tantrum because they're on social media, sometimes that is just a breath of air that parents need to take. That's how iPad babies form. And yet, this extremely hard task of setting boundaries with your children around technology is one that needs to be prioritized. Unfettered social media access can be catastrophic for children, as the show itself demonstrates, but as research also demonstrates. Parents cannot be uninvolved or permissive when it comes to this. And it's also very hard because kids are still going to be exposed to these things in their peer group, at school, so you're not going to be able to fully protect them. If they want to seek out these things online, they're going to have an opportunity to do so. But you just have to do your best. And you have to advocate within the system too. Maybe surround them with peers whose parents have similar values on this topic so that when they go to their friend's house, they're not just, doing these things on their friend's computer instead. In the very last episode, we see Jamie's parents trying to grapple with the responsibility of being the ones who created him. And his mom admits she should have recognized the son's temper and stopped it, which I agree with. And she also acknowledges that Jamie's dad has a bad temper, which again, I agree with. And I think modeling is very important. And they're kind of trying to reassure each other, saying that they were good parents, they did all they could. There is this concept in psychology of the good enough parent, that no parent is perfect, but if you're good enough, that's good enough, basically. And yeah, perfection doesn't exist. But what if sometimes being a good parent isn't good enough? And maybe that's not entirely the parent's fault either. Like the parents were wondering how their daughter turned out so okay, but the boy didn't, when they raised them probably around the same. But they're not considering that there are genetic and temperamental and gender differences. Socialization can look different for boys versus girls. Socialization can look different based on birth order. The fact that their daughter's a little bit older maybe means she's had more time to adjust to social media being in her life. So it's the classic fault versus responsibility fallacy. There were things that the parents could have done differently that might have prevented this from happening. But they did the best with the information and the resources they had at the time. So I don't think that they should blame themselves for what happened. I do think they deserve empathy and compassion. And I also think it's constructive for them to take responsibility for what they could have done differently. They were good parents, but sometimes being a good parent is not good enough, especially when in combination with all the other factors that cause this to happen. If I were in this position myself, I really tried to think what if I had a son who turned out to be an incel and who turned out to do a hate crime? I feel like I would need to take full responsibility for that. And I would try to also balance that with self-compassion, with the knowledge that I did the most with the tools that I had at my disposal. But one thing I would do differently from the parents in the show is I would stop trying to reassure myself that I was a good parent, because labels can be defensive and they can impede truly taking responsibility for what you could have done differently. And in the very last scene, we see the dad's pain and vulnerability as he's crying into his son's teddy bear. And I think it's so healthy that he's finally expressing his emotions, and specifically what's underneath his anger, which is grief. And that might be the very first step in severing the cycle of intergenerational trauma, is him finally coming to terms with the grief underlying his anger and processing it and learning to express it and regulate it in healthy ways. And he tucks in his son's teddy bear, kisses him, and apologizes to him. The teddy bear here represents a transitional object, which is any object that serves as like a sense of security or a symbolic connection with someone else. Children will often have a transitional object for their parents, for instance. When I was 3 years old, my parents were already living in the US. I was still living in Romania, and they brought home a toy monkey that I became super, super attached to. That monkey was for me a transitional object because I didn't have access to my parents during that time. So this is super common among children who are still developing the emotional skills that they need to comfort themselves, to soothe their own emotions. So it really speaks to the dad's developmental age that he was leaning on a transitional object as a crutch in middle age. It really speaks to how regressed he is and how much emotional work he has to do. What about the school? Is the school responsible for what happened? We learned that Jamie was doing well in school, but some of the teachers reported some recent behavioral problems. The teachers in the second episode seemed super overwhelmed. Some of them were even like absent from the classroom. Every class was just playing videos for the kids, which is just like such a lazy form of teaching to only do that. And the students are just completely out of control. They just cannot be disciplined. When I saw those scenes, I remember thinking it's like the adults have just no bargaining chips with these children. It's like there's nothing they could say or do that would convince these children to behave. And I was wondering, is this due to permissive parenting at home, culture of permissive teaching at school? Is it worsened by the trauma of it being like a low socioeconomic status school maybe? Like, what's going on? Like, is this what schools are like these days? Because this is certainly not what I experienced growing up. So I don't know if this is just like certain schools in particular or if this is common across schools. If you are a teacher, I would love to hear from you. What about the peer group? Is the peer group responsible for what happened? One of Jamie's friends is the one who provided the murder weapon, the knife, and it's not depicted much in the show, but presumably his friends have similar attitudes towards women, so it's possible that that was a factor. What about the internet? Is the internet responsible? We learned that Jamie was reposting thirst traps to his story on Instagram, leaving pretty aggressive comments and innuendos under women's pictures. There are a lot of shots in the show of students using social media at school, at home, everywhere. And we don't hear much about what Jamie's social media usage actually looked like, but we can assume that he went down a bad path. Personally, I do think that the internet holds a great deal of responsibility for what happened. More on that in a second. What about gender roles? Are they to blame for what happened? Jamie says during his psychological assessment that he's gotten to second base with 2 girls already, and then he admits that that was a lie, which really speaks to like the expectation among boys of sexual maturity at a very young age, that they have to sort of prove their masculinity by getting girls as if they're like, notches on their bedpost. And we also find out that Katie's indecent photos got passed along the school, and Jamie asked her out because he thought that she would go out with him while she was at her lowest, which speaks to gender roles for girls of like expected purity and how they're seen as like tainted or lower value if someone violates their privacy. We also see how Jamie tries to embarrass and aggravate a grown woman, the psychologist. This really speaks to the complex power dynamics between men and women and how gender intersects with other factors like age. I have seen this sometimes on very rare occasions where a boy will be abusive to a grown woman because even though there is the age power imbalance where the woman has more power, because of gender, he feels entitled to more power over her, or somehow he feels like he's higher up on the hierarchy or something. We also hear Jamie say that he's better than most boys because most boys would have essayed Katie when they had the knife. So there is definitely something deeply disturbing about the way Jamie sees interactions between males and females. But perhaps the most important question we should be asking: Is Jamie responsible for what happened? Up until the end of the show, he keeps repeating, I haven't done anything wrong, I didn't do it. We see this continuous lack of accountability, and he's almost convinced of his own innocence. Children are the responsibility of their parents or of the adults who look after them. But learning to take responsibility for themselves is a gradual process that must proceed as age appropriate. Whether it means teaching a 5-year-old to clean up after themselves when they spilled some milk, or teaching a 10-year-old to remember to do their own homework, or teaching a 15-year-old that it's no one's fault but their own that they got into a car accident. It's a gradual process, but being a minor is really complicated in terms of responsibility. Because on one hand, you are your own individual, no one can control what you choose to do. But at the same time, you are not a fully developed adult. You can't really think for yourself. And you are under the guardianship of a responsible adult. So it's really tricky to parse out, is it his responsibility or not? What I can say for sure is that it's his fault, that the crime occurred. It is absolutely Jamie's fault. I think some of the responsibility probably also falls on some of the other factors that I mentioned. But there is also something about Jamie specifically that caused this to happen. The psychology of Jamie is he seems like a smart boy, very interpersonally perceptive, but also very poor emotion regulation. Multiple times he gets very angry when the psychologist doesn't reassure him about his dad not being ashamed of him, or when he calls himself ugly. And when she's about to leave, he has another outburst, and he desperately wants to hear that she likes him as a person. So we see this deep insecurity, this need for validation from external sources, this deep sense of shame that Jamie holds, possibly caused by the fact that he feels his dad is ashamed of him, possibly caused by, gender roles that he feels he doesn't live up to, possibly caused by maybe something internal about him that he feels he's lacking. But I was also struck that Jamie did not seem to feel much empathy or remorse for his crime or for what happened to Katie. He thought what he did to her was justified because she was a bully bitch. This total lack of empathy is not typical of people who don't have very severe trauma history. Yeah, he was bullied a bit, but he was also indoctrinated by the manosphere into dehumanizing girls and women. He didn't experience major trauma at home. He had friends at school. There was no sexual trauma that we know of. So there was no traumatic reason why he should have this total lack of empathy towards half of the population. And yet, because of his falling down this pipeline, that's exactly what happened. Maybe there's also a genetic component here. It's possible maybe he inherited his grandpa's propensity for violence as well. So that's something we should consider as well. Bottom line though, we may never know who is truly responsible for something like this, because I suspect it's multifactorial. There's not one singular cause. If I were to say who is the biggest to blame, it's of course Jamie, and also the manosphere, predatory men on the internet who indoctrinate young boys into dehumanizing women for their own profit. Jamie certainly shares some of the blame too, as the one who actually committed the crime, who was responsible for his own actions. But it's difficult to say to what extent, since he's a minor who can't properly think for himself, who is the responsibility of the adults around him, his parents, his teachers, everyone. And if I were to say who's the most responsible but not at fault for what happened, I'd say it's the parents. But I do think they also deserve compassion because, again, they did the most with the information and the tools that they had at the time. What are your thoughts on this? Who do you think is responsible? Who do you think is to blame if you've seen the show? And before you click away from this video, let me just tell you a quick word about my upcoming novel. I'm so excited to announce that my second novel, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, is now available for pre-order. If you love lush, atmospheric, haunting gothic horror, then this is the book for you. It's set in coastal Washington in 2 timelines, and it follows 2 protagonists, one in the modern times who fears intimacy, and one in the Victorian era who thinks stealing love will make her whole. So if this sounds up your alley, follow the link in my bio or in the pinned comment below so that you can pre-order your copy. Pre-orders are only available for ebooks at this time. The paperbacks and hardcovers will also become available once the book is released on June 2nd, 2025. Check it out and stay spooky.